Easy Explain the Philosophy of Margaret Cavendish, an overview. So here we're going to start out by looking at just Cavendish as a person, her life and works, her times. She was born as Margaret Lucas in England. She is English, in 1623. In 1645, she's going to marry William Cavendish. At the time, he is the Duke of Newcastle, and thus through marriage, she becomes Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle. So fast forward a little bit, in 1666, she publishes her Observations upon Experimental Philosophy. That's the main work we're going to be pulling from through this playlist. And she really puts herself on the map as a woman philosopher, and that really wasn't a thing at the time. So it's a pretty big deal. Around the same time, in 1668, she also writes a utopian, fictitious novel called The Blazing World. There's ounces of philosophy in there, but otherwise, if you're interested in readings from that time period, definitely check it out. And to end Margaret's life, she died in 1673, and she's entombed in Westminster Abbey with her son William. You can still visit them today for a nominal fee. So just to set up her philosophy in general, right, kind of en masse, she's entering this world of natural philosophy. That's largely what it's called at the time. And even the title of her book, Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, that's a bit of a criticism. She's largely entering into this time where Descartes, Hobbes, Boyle, and Hooke are reigning supreme. And she's going to say what they're doing is very experimental. It doesn't actually align with the craft and the trade at the time. So a little bit of a dig there. We're going to look more into that as we progress. But also looking ahead, we see some really cool things where she's kind of laying some groundwork to thermodynamics, and where maybe we could even say that she was of influence to the ideas of Spinoza and Leibniz as well. We'll get to that later as well here. But first, to really paint with a broad brush and sum up her philosophical system, again, in light of the context she's entering. So, if we think of Descartes and Hobbes and Boyle and Hooke, we would largely call them philosophical mechanists, and Descartes is going to be against all that. She's going to object to all of that, and she's going to propose a philosophical vitalism. So just to kind of set up the very large-scale argument of what's going on here. So if we look at the four contemporaries of Cavendish, they would say that the natural world is made up of material parts, and everything is interacting following these causal laws of motion, like collisions and all of that. But Cavendish is going to say, no. Everything is alive, at least to some extent. Everything at least has at least one principle of life. And for Cavendish, that one principle of life that at least everything has is something she's going to call self-motion. And we're going to get way into that later. But for now, very basically, it's the idea that things move themselves. And that means they're alive. And everything has this. So to borrow from the edition I've been reading from and studying from, it's edited and put together by Eugene Marshall. He does a really good job in the beginning of putting together this main argument that Cavendish has for just supplanting mechanism with vitalism. So let's look at the first three premises here. Bodies move in orderly and infinitely variable ways. Premise 2, bodies are either moved by spirits or moved by bodies. Premise 3, bodies cannot be moved by spirits because that is mysterious. So our first conclusion here is bodies must be moved by bodies. So first big checkpoint. So premise 4, if bodily motion issues from bodies, then it must issue from either inanimate matter, which would imply mechanism, or animate matter, living things, that would imply vitalism. So the next premise 5, the mechanistic approach to bodily motion cannot account for the infinite variety and orderliness of all activity in nature. So that jumps us to our second conclusion. Bodily motion cannot issue from immanent matter. We've essentially just disproved mechanism, but we still have to get to the proof of vitalism. So one more premise here. Animate matter, vitalism, has an ability to produce an infinite variety of orderly effects. And that's just Cavendish's definition here. So our final conclusion in this argument is the bodily cause of motion must be the body's animate matter. It must come from this principle of self-motion. So that's how we debunk mechanism coming out of the gate and establish and set up this cause for vitalism. And one more thing to touch on here as an overview. You could really either start with this or end with this. The alpha or the omega, right, for the Cavendishian God. Cavendish really doesn't write much on God, as her view is that within natural philosophy, that's really not the place for discussing God. Leave that to faith and religion, is what she says. But there are a few selections I'd just like to point out here for starters. One taken from her chapter 10 of the Observations of Natural Sense and Reason. Cavendish says there is an infinite difference between divine attributes and natural properties. Wherefore, to symbolize our reason, will, understanding, faculties, passions, and figures, etc., to God is too high a presumption, and in some manner a blasphemy, So again, she's saying it's too presumptuous. It may even be blasphemous to try to philosophize about God. So let's not do it. Let's actually not focus our attention there. But she does say that God is above nature. This actually gets into how she does define him and then move on. So if we go to chapter 11, in what she calls a general knowledge of worship of God given him by all natural creatures, she defines God as follows. God is incomprehensible and above nature, literally supernatural, but inasmuch as can be known to wit his being, and that he is all-powerful, and that not anything can be compared or likened to him, for he is beyond all draught and likeness, as being an eternal, infinite, omnipotent, incorporeal, indivisible, immovable being. And finally, she kind of leaves it, this sets us up very well for moving ahead for next time, that God is the cause of nature and nature the effect of God. In doing her natural philosophy and in incorporating vitalism and talking about self-motion, Cavendish is going to write a lot about nature. So for now, I hope this helps.